have one topic we're originally starting off with, which was Thomas's, and then we got a couple, three others after that we picked up before our meeting today. And if any of you have anything that you think should be brought up, I will add it to the list. And if we don't get to it today, we get to it next time. The only thing I do want to mention is that on April 13th, Tuesday, April 13th, my orthopedic surgeon has scheduled me again for the third time to have a right shoulder replacement. And so we're hoping that there's not some super spreader event that cancels it out again. But in any case, it's I guess, how do I say it? And I've said it many times. If it's because of what another orthopedic surgeon said to me years ago when I had a knee replacement. He said, you could wait another 10, 15 years, but it's the collateral damage to the joint that will prevent a full recovery. And so if you do need a, replacement, don't wait until you are in such bad shape that the replacement isn't going to accomplish much. Because I've seen, people with knee replacements that it hasn't. But anyway, okay, we have Kris Kademian, we have Janet Chenault with us. Where'd Kris go? Kris Kademian. Okay, so our first topic is, oh, there he is. He's up at the top. You're the top of the list, Kris. Anyway, our first topic is, how does my Kime affect jujitsu techniques? And this is from Thomas. In my karate training, Kime is fundamental in focusing intensity at a key point, but the karate approach tends towards a one strike and finish, ideally. In jujitsu, with concern for flow and circularity, does Kime play a little different role? Thomas. Okay, just to get the karate definition straight from Thomas, are you saying that and I've got Stuart on my screen. Am I on your screen big or?
Yeah, you're on mine.
Okay. My question for Thomas is, when you're saying a one strike and finish, and you're saying that the focusing the intensity at one point, are you saying you only want the strike or whatever it is to go to a certain point and then you stop? Or do you mean the strike is going towards one specific target?
Yeah, a little bit of both, but maybe something altogether different as well. Hold on just a second. Let me shut that down. Okay, I'm at my church office and Saturday morning calls. So here we go. So what I'm talking about is the way Kime works in Shotokan, which is another art that I train in. If someone throws a round punch and I'm stepping forward with a block, or if I step off to the side and do a counter strike, my intention is to focus so much energy and intensity on that one strike that theoretically it's the showstopper. So kind of the one strike, one kill mentality. There's a Japanese phrase that escapes me right now that talks about that. And so what I find is, because jiu-jitsu came before karate in my experience, I'm generally not as intentional with those types of things in terms of I'm not trying to stop everything. I'm always looking to redirect so that I can flow into whatever the jujitsu technique is going to be. I think it comes down to the distinction in my mind between linear and circularity in technique. And so I'm trying to balance, and it may not be that there is a balance, there may be a distinction that needs to be maintained. But if I put as much intensity as my Shotokan tells me to put into the first strike, it's often very difficult to flow into the jujitsu because so much of it has been targeted in, whereas jujitsu is trying to absorb and move. That's what is the genesis of that question.
Okay, and now I have to ask the second part, because this determines my response. After you have blocked or struck, is there a retraction of your hand or leg and or your body to back to a original position?
There could be. I mean, if I'm doing a lunge punch or kazuka, then I'm probably not concerned to retract. But it could be that if I'm in a horse stance and I strike, my hikate comes back and I'm coming in as such, which seems very counterintuitive for my jujitsu.
Right. No, I understand. No, I'm just trying to get a feeling here. It really, how do you say it? It really, okay, let me rephrase, start all over here. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think with jiu-jitsu, at least the way I was taught, was that if you're going to strike, there are two things going. Number one, you can attempt to strike for effect, but in jiu-jitsu, you never assume anything that's going to work, or be as effective as you'd like it to be, and so you automatically have to have something else to go with or finish the rest of the techniques. That's one part of it. The other part is, although you may be striking to a specific target, with jiu-jitsu, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, we will tend to strike through the target rather than to the target. And combined with that, okay, our bot, rather than just hitting, for example, we would, if it's a right strike, we would take a step forward with our right foot so that we get our body behind any strike, rather than just doing the strike or kick or what have you, because we want to use the momentum from the body, from our center, rather than just whacking away at at a target. So are we still in line together somewhat, or?
We are. That emphasis on striking through rather than to, it attains in Shotokan as well. Okay. But what the challenge is, and this is really more of a, I'm just considering at this point in my martial development, 4 decades in, is it really possible that a linear and a circular art fundamentally can come together in any way? And I'm not certain that they can. I'm thinking there's a reason jiu-jitsu is not karate and karate is not jiu-jitsu.
I think.
Sensei, can I expand a little bit?
Sure.
Sure. TJ, I like what you're saying. I agree. And Sensei, what you said on the strike through, we would take the same approach as well. But on TJ's perspective, I would think that the linear versus the circularity, I like to continue the flow. So we still enter with absorbing the strike, trying to move off of the direct line of path, and then absorbing that, continuing into a circular motion. Now, if you're going to give an atemi or a mitsubushi to distract that individual or the potential attacker from what they're trying to accomplish and hurting you, then you do that with one of those atemis or mitsubushi to not completely, I guess, terminate the scenario. You're going to continue the flow of that circularity motion in a jiu-jitsu aspect to be able to move from one technique or even the initial technique to finish or a throw or into another technique flowing into another position of advantage for yourself. That's how I would take the approach for myself.
Yeah, and that's a great way to think of it, Darren. That's basically what I'm doing. So if I take a jiu-jitsu kata, a flow drill, which I have my students do, like what Dave Clark does. Dave's video on that is great in his material. And I compare that to, say, high-end Shodan in Shotokan. So one of their kata. Their kata those kata are definitely strike and finish this aggressor, move to the next one. Strike and finish this aggressor, move to the next one. And the turning is not so much flowing as it is moving down that imbusen line. And it really is two sides of my martial arts brain. And I was thinking, maybe I'm just broken and I can't. But there is a distinct approach happening there that are across the lines.
Can I jump in for a sec? The linear and the circularity don't seem to be at odds with each other or mutually exclusive. Part of my background is in boxing, and the linear can be a straight punch, but the linear can also refer to diagonal foot movement, which is what Darren was referring to earlier, where as you come in, say with a straight cross punch, you are also you blocked, you got a cross, and then your footwork is going linear, but it's a diagonal line, and that gets you away from his power hand, and you're moving toward his jab hand, but that's already been deflected. So you've taken away his ability to counter. He's got to turn to face you, and you're at his side. So at that point, you're shooting fish in a barrel.
Yeah.
He's going down, or he's going to get struck in a place in a way he doesn't want to get struck. The other thing is we talk about hitting to or through, and jab punches in boxing are specifically designed to hit forward, but not through. And what you're doing is going on a fishing expedition.
Right.
You're setting them up, you're finding out who's going to blink and who's not. And then once that jab has told you some things about how this guy moves and how much he flinches and how much he blinks and where he puts his body and how close he is or how far he backs off, that tells you when and where you can land that cross. And that can be a one and done perhaps, but one and done punches are the exception, not the rule.
I think that was great put, Dave. I mean, that's commonly referred to as the feel out process in today's sports entertainment industry.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Where this has evolved with me is I never block and don't grab, because I know I'm going from step 1 to 2 to 3, and I'm eventually wanting to absorb. And so that's very out of the norm for Shotokan, for example. It's not block and grab. There are some, but by and large, all my blocks are blocks and grabs so that I affect a soft brace. So when I do strike, I may drill it in and through, but I still got you. And we're going to continue on the merry-go-round. But that's very different than traditional Shotokan approach has been. And I've got license to do some of it, but
maybe one way of looking at the Shotokan is to think of it as a much larger circle.
I like that.
That creates the illusion that you are moving in a straight line. I don't know if that's a cop-out. As far as boxing is concerned, I used to have a student whose nickname was Rocky. He stood about 6-something, built essentially like a fire hydrant. But he had been in boxing, and he was the most difficult person to work with. And one of the things, I learned a lot from him in terms of, as Dave mentioned, you've got this. They want to get you're in boxing, your opponent wants to get a feel for you, so they lob out a few jabs, and as Mr. Stone used to tell me, he says, those jabs are the ones you have to block because that's like their radar, and it lets them know where you're going to be. And if you don't let them know where you're going to be, then they can't get that good strike into you. So he said that's one concept of follow. The other issue is you have to realize that if you strike someone, and this is whether it's for effect or not, the fact that you have struck them, or whether it makes a effective physical contact, or knocks her teeth out or whatever, regardless of what it does to them, it's going to create a distraction. And in jiu-jitsu, the purpose of the hit generally, or strike, is, or whatever else you do, is an initial, I forget what the term is now, distraction technique, is to distract them. And that gets you anywhere from 3 to 7/10 of a second to do whatever else you want to do. And that's the purpose of it. If the strike ends up being effective, so much the better. That's if your goal is to have an effective strike, great, but you then go into whatever else you are going to do to complete the technique, because there are some people you can hit them in the face and they'll stand there and smile at you and say, "What's next?" And then you're in trouble. So you as Thomas says, you do your strike and move in and grab hold and do whatever you can. The other thing to consider is that because you're striking and moving in, and as Thomas says, you're moving in a circular circular manner. Your strike, for example, if I was going to strike someone in the solar plexus, okay, theoretically, and I don't know, like, this is going to make sense because I can't see what I'm doing really. Let me see if I can get. Where am I here? Oh, there I am. Okay. If I'm going to come in for a hit, I'm not going to come in for a strike, and here's my opponent, and then go in for a hip throw. Okay, then what I'm going to do is strike, and then I'm going to slide and strike with the elbow. And you can notice I'm already moving in, and then I'm into his body once I've made my contact here, because my arm isn't out. It's at my side, but I'm still hitting with my elbow, and then return and do the hip throw or whatever else. And that's your goal, is to get into the attacker's center and off balance him so you can do whatever you want to do. And so maybe how do you say, strikes are more circular. I don't know, strikes are not really circular, but your movement is.
If they are circular, they're haymakers, and you'll see it coming a mile away.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I don't let my students in class do roundhouses. I said, that's, if you don't see that coming a mile away, you're in deep trouble. Okay. It's the straight in punches that you have to worry about. And that's what we train against mostly. You can block a roundhouse. If you can see an attack coming, you can do something about it. But a short strike, straight strike in is more difficult to block and deal with, along with that retraction, than a roundhouse is.
So Sensei, I think that what you were saying with that radar, to back up a little bit, I wanted to catch up a couple of things. The radar of the jab, so to speak, is important for you to continue to do, again, what like I was mentioning to Dave earlier, is that bob and weave technique. You might get touched every now and then, but you're not in line for the big shot, as you mentioned.
Right.
And then the next thing would be, once you are successful in being able to block or defend, is the next thing coming in with the trap to start to enter your circle. And then you had mentioned a couple of strikes. So maybe you're going with one strike and then following up as you're entering into another strike as you're entering your technique or your circle. A couple of things with the circle, depending on what type of strike that you're defending, how small my circle is. Usually if it's a direct strike or a straight strike, my circle is very, very, very small. If it's a round strike or a roundhouse punch or something, then I can open up my circle and make it a little bit bigger and continue with my flow. And then the last thing that I like to do with any strike that I'm countering with after I'm absorbing or escaping, blocking, then trapping the initial strike coming at is whatever technique that I'm trying to go into, I try to stay consistent with my Mitsubishi or Temi, my follow-up strike in entry to be consistent with where I'm going. So if I want to throw forward, then I want to get a low strike, helping with the momentum and the balance and making my attacker move in that direction easier as well.
Right.
So just a couple of things that I like to do.
And it's important because I ran this about a week or two. Someone asked me, it was a question, had with not one of our Saturday things, but it was an email that was sent to me, asked to know if we had any, if the guillotine choke was used in jujitsu. The guillotine is a headlock from the front side of the head. You know, his body's here, his head is back there. And it took me a while to, do we have any techniques to do that, right? And
Absolutely, we certainly do.
I said, yeah, we do. He showed me, you know, he referred me to a couple of MMA videos, and they were showing counters and reverses for the forward headlock or guillotine, whatever you want to call it.
They're awesome.
The reverses and counters were great. The downside was that in neither of the videos I saw, the hold wasn't set completely. And if that hold is set completely and properly, that little puppy is, you know, that headlock is going to be really hard to get out of without breaking your neck. Which is why they have rules. But that's, you know.
Sensei, that would be a great topic for next week, because we could go into how to get out of a guillotine when it is set. And there are some techniques that, like you say, would you go into when the guillotine is being set. But there are some that guillotine is set solid, and you're about to experience that nasty neck crank, and maybe you've already experienced it, but it's set solid. You can still come out, and that'd be a good place to go in class someday.
Okay, maybe we can save that for next week if you want. The only thing I wanted to bring up on it was that if you're going to set, I mean, just to prevent because there's a difference between the street and MMA or BJJ, okay, for within the dojo competition and all that stuff. And if we're going to set the guillotine or front headlock, before I do that, and one thing I mentioned to this person is, I'll come in, instead of just wrapping the arm around the person's head and setting this guillotine, okay? And then when you bring this guillotine up, I'll say, don't just bring it up, turn your hand palm down, which drives the forearm into their larynx, which really makes life rough for them, even if you don't have it tight. But before I even come in, I'll say, you need to come in with an elbow to his ear or just below his ear and strike through. And if he remains conscious after that, you can then set your guillotine and set it completely, and you will not have any resistance or have to worry about anything else. I think the difference between many other martial arts and jiu-jitsu is that we tend to be, how do you say, we're talking survival, and we're not talking about being nice. Someone, and the same person asked me, well, what do you do if a person has a guillotine really sit on you? And my first answer was, based on Sensei Harold Grotius's teachings, grab him by the testicles and squeeze like hell. If you can get there, if it works, if you can get, he's going to let go because he's going to have some real other serious problems. It's not about fighting clean. It's not about, counter. It's about setting up a hold so the person cannot get out of it. And we do a lot of things, we do a wrist press on the ground, the person taps out. And students just have to realize on the street, you come down and you break the person's wrist. It's not about, on the street, you don't submit people. The real world doesn't work that way.
Of course, Sensei, what you just said is it's not about fighting clean. There is no clean. It's just all fair game.
Right.
Okay, so I would like to take this conversation in a slightly different direction because Thomas's first question was very intriguing and Dave started to address it. And I'd like to see what other people's opinions are. To me, one of the important aspects is the mentation, because when I started my other martial art, I tried to incorporate what I'd learned from jujitsu, and I was what you call a victim, because the inclination to be a defended, reactive entity in a fight means that your opponent always gets like the first shot or so. And this doesn't work. It took me several years to unlearn jujitsu and learn that the first thing I had to do was to throw myself at my opponent, attacking furiously to put them on the defensive, because otherwise they could choose their shots. And if there was a disparity in skill level or an experience level, that meant I was out. So to me, it's not so much the straight versus the circular or the through versus the jab to the surface, as it is the idea of whether or not you have that hard approach of taking the fight to your opponent and smashing them. And that is something that I think is part of this discussion. What little I ever took of karate was much more similar in attitude than jujitsu is, where the perfect style in jujitsu is that you receive an attack, are impregnable to it, and then you respond by using your opponent's force against them and destroy them, right? But you have to get by that first barrier of they get the first punch. So I wanted to see how other people react to this. And it's not so much a philosophical as just what I find to be an essential flaw in the reality of jujitsu.
Actually, I look at that as the reality of Aikido, which is a very defensive martial art. But I don't look at that as a reality of jiu-jitsu because we do have strikes. Granted, if you come from a striking background, boxing, you've got footwork already in place. The challenge being that when you got 12-ounce boxing gloves on, you're not going to be doing much grabbing. So you learn strikes. But if you have MMA gloves on, you can box and grab. But the footwork, that you have to have in boxing is very valuable in all other martial arts I can imagine.
Yes.
And it's a great place to start, because you got footwork down, everything comes from the ground up. That footwork's in place, man. You go places that you wouldn't be otherwise, and that's going to be your advantage.
Yeah. As an older guy, I have to admit that I'm older. Sometimes I've got to ask myself, boy, I was like Darren. I still think that mentally, but I know that I'm not. But I think in terms of, my martial development, back in the day, it was all, Chinatown in New York, and all those movies, and I started actually in Goju-Ryu. And there's a figure in, I think, Peter Urban's book called, I think it's Master Oyama, where he actually takes the bull out, but the story? Takes the bull out with one. So back in the day, it was kind of a one punch mentality. Everybody was going to do something with one punch, right? And so, kind of following to that, because that was the nature of the beast. And then I went to college and then discovered judo. It's like, wow, right? I could do some things, that I couldn't do, or I was unaware of in karate and stuff, So and then just kind of going on with that, hopscotch through different arts and to end up in jujitsu. I start reading Black Belt magazine and discovering jujitsu through the magazines, and then taking seminars and stuff. So my development, my thought has moved away from the one punch, and now I'm into a more of a series approach. So that anything that I'm doing is going to have at least a minimum of 3 moves, distinct moves. As Dave said, the footwork is important. Yeah, the footwork is part of what you got to do. Because if you stand there, you're going to get hit. If you don't, move the body, the Tatsubaki piece, you're going to get hit. Okay, as well as the block, and then what do you do after that? Is it a punch? Is the punch the end? So I'm a 3 or 4 person kind of move, and that's how I kind of operate, because I've been hit in terms of fights, and I didn't realize that until I was punched. Man, I could take a punch. not that I want to take a punch, but again, it was one of those. I guess they were thinking that, man, I'm going to deck this guy with one punch, and it was like the initial shock, but I didn't feel any pain, and I was back again. So I realized from my side, the other side, is that I'm not going to be satisfied with the one punch, because I've taken seminars with George Dillman. When the Dillman pressure point stuff was a hot topic and stuff like that right here too. And I know there's some value in pressure point type stuff, punches and stuff like that. But I've kind of moved away from that, believing that I can end it with one strike. And I don't know if that's age or what.
Well, if I might, I appreciate that, Lonnie. If I want to make sure that I'm not drawing a caricature, because when I'm talking about Kime and the idea that the intensity is such that theoretically the first strike is the last strike, I don't mean to communicate that that's how Shotokan is being taught. Their one steps are multiple movements, but intensity is such that every one could stop it. And I certainly agree that it's a complex series involved in Goshin Waza. What the genesis of my question was how to have full focus in one movement, knowing you need 3 or 4 probably to be done, when many times the one movement can be so intense, it might take the 3 or 4 off the table, even if it's unintentional. And that's where, for example, I say now a block is a grab, because I know that even if I strike as hard as I can, I'm not done. I'm moving through. And if I just to touch on Janet's point, if I might, when I started learning jiu-jitsu back in the early 90s, it was always Goshin Waza. It was always scenario based, with the assumption that you're going to be aware of a situation devolving, and when it happens, you respond. There were a handful, especially from some jiu-jitsu instructors I learned from that had taught in Guam. There were a handful of movements that were initiator movements, but most of the time the Goshin Waza was a response, but it wasn't, I'm waiting to be a victim. It's, I know that I need to be ready in the event that something comes. And I found the same thing in karate. I mean, Funakoshi Sensei's first rule is Karate begins and ends with courtesy. So it's self-defense oriented. So there's some theory there as well.
Yeah, I was curious about the encounter you were describing, Janet, if that was two willing participants in a sparring match, or if this was a self-defense scenario.
This is a sparring match. It's medieval broadsword fighting. So it's a quasi full contact. For somebody my size, it is thoroughly full contact. For somebody as large as some of you gentlemen, you might not want to throw with Thomas's full focus, because otherwise you might lack opponents. But what I really found was that if I took the philosophical stance of jujitsu and instead of doing a really strong initiation of the fight, that I would not make it through the initial contact point. And now I've been doing this other sport for over 40 years. And now I can see in the people who have only been doing it for 1 or 2 years, I can see what they are going through, because what seems to them to be a fully protected stance, to me, looks like it has huge target holes in it, right? And the only way they can overcome those targets that I can now see, because of all the years I've been doing it, is if instead of giving me that opportunity, they throw themselves at me and put me on the defensive. So now I'm understanding what's happening from both sides. But Thomas's question, I thought, brought it up very, very succinctly, because while I've been doing martial arts for most of my life, I am not a street fighter. You know, I do not walk down dark alleys looking for death.
One should.
And to your point, when I first came to jiu-jitsu, I had a boxing background and a karate background, 3 forms of karate, Shotokan, Shotokai, and Shito-ryu. And so when jiu-jitsu came along, I kept hearing the word on the street was traditional jiu-jitsu is Aikido strong and Judo strong and karate weak. And I thought, well, that's a good thing for me personally, because I come into jiu-jitsu with a striking background. What children will sometimes say they're victims of their upbringing. If your exposure to jiu-jitsu is primarily, jiu-jitsu is supposed to be like 3 parts: karate, aikido, and judo. And if your exposure was primarily aikido, defensive based, and judo, which is throwing based, then the striking was not emphasized in your jiu-jitsu training, then you were perhaps a quote victim of what the word on the street is that traditional jiu-jitsu is strike weak, but aikido and judo strong. I don't find that to be the case. I didn't find that to be the case in my experience studying with Sensei Kirby. But I also brought a whole lot of striking to the table when I arrived to study jiu-jitsu.
Dave, I can't agree more.
great.
I have a very strong boxing background as well, and as you and Lonnie was mentioning, the fundamentals of boxing is critically essential for your development in jiu-jitsu, in my opinion. The footwork and the ability to technically understand how to strike is very, very useful. And then to Jan's comments, one of the things that I have done throughout my development and training is when I came across these scenarios in randori, so the free practice of having multiple attackers, and you get to a point to where some of the ukes, they just don't want to engage, like they don't want to attack you. And so what I've done was I would have to have these discussions, because you're trying to develop your skill set and practice techniques that you're trying to use in a real life situation, but they won't give you an attack. because for whatever reason, they don't want to engage. So I would say when I effectively determine the need to have to respond, if you're gonna hesitate, then I'm gonna engage first. So when you get into a certain area, a certain range of threat, I'm not gonna wait for you to attack. I understand the threat already. I understand that it's gonna be a threat to me. So I engage myself before they actually have a shot to go first. And what you were saying, Jan, and just wait for the attack to move into a jiu-jitsu scenario.
Let me throw a word in here edgewise, and I think this is probably one of the best Zoom meetings we've had so far, because as I think Dave said before we got started today, more and more people are feeling confident enough to be involved and start saying what they think. And I'm really glad to see that, because the discussion has to be a discussion. I think the issue here is, I don't know whether you call it situational awareness of what. If you're in Janet's situation where you're wearing body armor and carrying long swords, etc., you are in a situation where it's more of like, I'm trying to find the right way of phrasing it. If you don't do something, the other person is. So you have to do it's a quote unquote battlefield situation. If you are in a sport competition for a martial art, you know that the other person is going to attack you. That's a given. And so you have to act accordingly, and you're coming first. And even in jiu-jitsu, as I've told my students on occasion, you can goad a person into attacking you. You can do that. It's just how you call it verbal jiu-jitsu. You can get a person to where they're going to attack you. You can, by your body, lead a person into attacking you. And that's, it's very hard for other people to pick up on that, but it's doable. What I think most jiu-jitsu people train for today is the unanticipated attack. You're walking down the street, you're talking to someone, someone grabs you from behind, and these are what are called unanticipated attacks. And that is different from a situation in which you are facing a person and they are going to attack you if you don't do something to them. And that, I think, is a difference. And
that's where I was going to with my question, whether these were two willing participants engaging, or if this was
you can have
scenario totally different.
Yeah, you can have two participants. They aren't necessarily willingly engaging, but the person who is, Janet, for example, knows what's going to happen if she doesn't act accordingly.
Right.
And that allows Janet, and I'm picking on you, Janet, it allows you to act proactively to protect yourself. And you might be able to argue that in court.
Well, I'd certainly have a better chance of arguing that in court than Darren would.
Yes. Yes, you would. Also because you're wearing glasses. No, but in all seriousness, if you're in a situation, for example, you're in the military on the battlefield, if you don't shoot the other person, they're going to shoot you. That's a given. So you have to act proactively. You have to be, for lack of a better phrase, you have to be aggressive. You have to be the aggressor. Or they're both aggressors, but you have to be the successful aggressor. And that's a different approach than, even if you're on the street, and I've been in this situation a couple of times where I've been approached by a person who I can sense by their body language that they're going to want something, or they're going to try to do something to me. And so you just, you have to act accordingly. And all of that's, defensive, or you might call it offensive.
Mhm.
Okay.
There's something else.
Let me finish it now.
Yes, sir.
I think we misassume that jujitsu is pure. I mean, I'll say jujitsu is completely defensive. You cannot attack a person with it. But you can lead a person into a situation where you can use what you know to defend yourself. And I don't know whether that's defensive or offensive. The other thing is, if you look at Hapkido and Jiu-Jitsu are almost identical, except that Hapkido is more offensive and Jiu-Jitsu is quote unquote defensive. And karate is, I don't know whether you call it offensive or it's all martial arts, quote unquote, are defensive when push comes to shove. But it's what you do with it that can make it, what you do can make it an offensive action on your part. And that may be because you realize I've got to do something before this guy knocks my teeth out or seriously injures me. And that's a judgment call, which raises another issue. But so I going back to Thomas's original question, which we're kind of circling the wagons, not to do a historical slur. We're circling we're circling the wagons on this. That as to what's defensive and what's offensive, and whether the straight movement in karate or on the line is just a way of, that's how the art defends, the martial artist in karate defends himself. Okay. It's a straight line. There are things we do in jiu-jitsu that are straight line. And it depends on what your follow through is. And follow through can be either it's a strike that goes either just to the point and retracts. And I tend to call those love taps. And they can stun a person and they can distract a person, or you can strike a person in particular areas and it actually takes them down and out, okay? Or severely injures them to the point where they cannot continue their attack and you simply step back, okay? And both of those approaches are valid. They're still straight line. So I think, that's, if I say anything else, I'm just going to be meandering off into the sunset.
Well, I got something directly related to this that's worth sharing, I think, because I don't know if everyone here went down the path I went, but you ever have a moment when you realize that you have been struggling with something that you shouldn't have struggled with for 10 years plus? And you go, I didn't know I was capable of that kind of ignorance. Well, I had one of those moments about 10 years into jiu-jitsu. And I'm sitting there going, wow. I felt supremely ignorant. We talk about linear movement, we talk about circular movement. And the fact of the matter is that we've got upper body, hand linear movement, but we've also got our feet moving in a linear fashion. So you got two types of linear movement you can discuss there. And when we talked about moving clockwise and counterclockwise, or to the right or to the left, it occurred to me about 10 years in that you have not just clockwise and counterclockwise, but we call it wall clockwise and wall counterclockwise, where you're doing this or this. That's very different from floor clockwise and floor counterclockwise. So when you say to somebody, move clockwise or counterclockwise, if you don't say wall, then you're not thinking this plane. And if you don't say floor, you're not thinking the floor plane, and it could be confused. So what I was doing is I was looking at techniques, and it says move clockwise. They may have meant my feet, and I was moving my hands. Or they had meant my hands, and I was moving my feet. To recognize that there are two planes of action for linear movement and for circular movement. One is a wall and one is a floor. One is horizontal, one's vertical. And that was the aha for me. And it was like, wow, the lights went on.
It's your,
Did anybody else have this revelation that took me 10 years to figure out?
it's the XY axis. Anyway,
I wanted to add something while we're on this topic. It seems to me that the linear versus the circular, the linear seems to be founded in a lot of foundational things like punches, straight and taisabaki. We're just moving in one direction. But when we start advancing and add a little more panache into our techniques, then we start getting into techniques that are not as basic, but we really start using that circular more. So we start seeing the circular come into play in all the more advanced stuff, or nearly all the more advanced stuff, but the linear still has a place in our foundations. So we really use them both, but often at different times. I mean, if you look at one technique in different ways, you can see them both, but I think that linear is more for that foundational stuff and those early techniques that you learn that, you know, I just want to block and then throw a punch. It's all linear and can be very devastating and helpful for that person in a self-defense situation. But at the same time, if you have some more skill, then maybe you may choose not to punch and do a throw instead, or a wrist lock, something that is a little more difficult to pull off, but encompasses that circular Kimes.
okay.
Silent.
All right. Okay.
Sensei, if you don't mind, this is off topic, but I just thought about it. This may be a good topic for next week. If I would certainly like to hear everybody's opinion versus one of the subjects that we had talked about a couple of weeks back in Japanese jiu-jitsu versus other styles of jiu-jitsu, and more specific, what the more popular jiu-jitsu is commonly referred to today in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I would like to hear some comments from everyone in regards to that, if we can make that a topic for next week. I mean, next session.
I would say, Darren, that in the public eye, Brazilian jiu-jitsu is more popular. But I would say that and throughout the course of history, that Brazilian jiu-jitsu is a flash in the pan compared to traditional jiu-jitsu.
Exactly.
And what Brazilian has done is just they happen to catch it in the whole mixed martial arts, which started out in no hold barred and became, you know, the mixed martial arts thing. But I mean, go back to pancration. Mixed martial arts has been around since before the Greeks. So the Brazilian likes to come across as the latest, greatest hot thing since the 1990s. But I beg to differ on two counts. Number one, there's largely a lack of humility, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of judgmental, but there's a large lack of humility in the people that I've worked with in Brazilian dojos. It's why I didn't go into dojos extremely early in life, because there was no room for me to learn. The egos were bouncing off the wall. And I don't like that about that martial art. And I still see that feeling. Any humility I experience feels like an attempt at humility, but not genuine humility.
I mean,
And again, Dave, I agree 100% on your approach to that. And one of the things that I was discussing with Sensei Kirby was the lack of humility also is where the lineage is from. You know, they only in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I'm not trying to offend anyone, but Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is just a fraction, in my opinion, of what Jiu-Jitsu really is, being a traditional Japanese art, which everyone is, or the majority of today's society, and with mixed martial arts and the popularity of BJJ, is completely forgotten and overlooked, thinking that it's a Brazilian art, which they're only using a fraction of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu.
Okay, let me throw a couple cents in, then we can leave this whole topic for another one, because but anyway, I think a lot of it comes down to, and I'm going to go back to when I was dealing with the LAPD and the martial arts advisory panel, and we had two distinct groups of BJJ practitioners. One group was the most courteous, professional, had a great deal of humility. The other group, for lack of a better phrase, humility, we know it all, etc. You know, so you have these two opposing attitudes with the same martial art, and I think that tends to happen. I don't want to stereotype. I know what the limitations of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are, and I'm not different with Darren or Dave, but I think we have to separate the art itself from the attitude of the practitioners, because otherwise we let a person's feelings affect how we consider the quote unquote actual facts or effectiveness of an art. I mean, years ago, decades ago, I was in Colorado, and I was going to do a seminar on ground defenses. And half the US Olympic judo team showed up. And I said, oh my God, what are, you know, these guys, these guys are going to run circles around me, you know, and I've got to replan what I was going to do. As it turned out, there was a significant difference between jiu-jitsu groundwork and submissions and judo groundwork and submissions, particularly for the Olympics. And there were a lot of things they were not allowed to do. They were really good at what they did, but there were a lot of things that they were not allowed to do for safety's sake. And that's what we ended up doing. We ended up being, you know, it worked out very well. Because rather than being, well, this is jiu-jitsu, this is what you do, and this is Olympic judo, and this is what you do, we said, okay, what's the difference, and what can we learn from each other? And fortunately, everybody there was in I say, very positive learning attitude, and we benefited from it. So I think we have to separate the attitude that people have as practitioners of a particular martial art and the art itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, I know some jiu-jitsu people that are incredibly humble. And people look at me and they say, you teach jiu-jitsu? You know, because I'm 5'9", you know, Lonnie, I don't like to use the word old. I like to use the word experienced. To me, old is an attitude of the mind. So, Lonnie, you and I are very experienced. But I think we have to look at, rather than looking at the person, or their attitude, we have to look at the art itself. Although I will agree with Darren and Dave, there are some people who think that their art is God's gift to mankind, and therefore they should be considered God's gift to mankind. And but they're separate issues. Anyway, okay.
Valid point. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's you've got to get past the person. I mean, I have my personal opinions about jujitsu. We all do, but I don't know of anyone who's with us today is going to get up on a tall column of salt and say, I am the best, or I think I'm really a great person because I know jujitsu. The world doesn't work that way. I hope not. Anyway.
Sensei, can I add something? I'm gonna just kind of summarize everything that everybody said, and maybe throw in my 2 cents as somebody that actually practices karate and also jujitsu and a few other things. To me, everything comes down to 3 main categories. There's the science portion, there's the art, and then there's the philosophy. So the very last thing that was talked about here is kind of attitudes and stuff. That's all in the philosophy aspect. So even if somebody doesn't, fully understand that they have a philosophy, they do in the way they practice.
Yes.
And the philosophy is anywhere from never do harm to strike first, strike hard, no mercy, and everything in between. And that kind of dictates then how that person teaches and what the purpose for their training is. Is it to enter a competition and win the competition? Is it to be a street fighter? Is it to be a military combatant? So the philosophy is going to dictate what's taught and how it's taught. And so then you have the science portion, and the science, hopefully we would find some commonality because physics is physics. It's a universal law, right? So, how to take somebody off balance, how to generate power, how to direct power, footwork and angles and this and that. So if you're doing something halfway decent, those things should, it's like 1 + 1. If you can't get past that, then there's no point in having a discussion. You're doing a different math. But I think where most people get stuck, and I hear the discussion a lot in this direction, is the art portion. And the art portion is, it's your technique, which to me is the delivery of the science, and then it's your strategy, which then lends itself to the philosophy that you're prescribing to, okay? Because your strategy is going to differ based on your philosophy. So if you're going to be training for the street or military combatant, your strategy is always going to account for multiple opponents. But if your philosophy is, sport to win a competition, then your strategy is going to be very different. It's going to be more one-on-one in a contained environment and a setting, type of perspective. So I think people spend a lot of time in the art portion without really thinking about the philosophy and the science. So coming back to the original question about Kime, okay, in Japanese, there's 2 kinds of really focus that is stressed. There's Metsuke, which is eye focus, and then there's Kime, which is body focus. And I think we get in trouble when we think that hard and soft are either or, okay? They're not mutually exclusive. They both have a place in everything we do, whether you practice under the banner of jujitsu, aikido, karate, all these things, those 2 concepts exist. So ju is soft and go is hard, okay? So for example, Shotokan was brought up as the example of karate. Well, Shotokan, even though Genshin Funakoshi was an Okinawan person and practiced Shorin-ryu karate, which is more soft and flowing, his students eventually turned it into something else for sport purposes. And that art had a lot of contribution from Kendo. And Kendo had become the sport version of Kenjutsu. So you have kind of parry and thrust, because it was much more linear. It was one-on-one, and for the purpose of penetration, getting the job done, getting back out. And so those concepts, so in Shotokan, Shotokan became a sport essentially, over time. And so the philosophy changed, and so the sporting concepts influenced, the sporting philosophy influenced the strategy, and then therefore the technique, which is the delivery, of the science they're practicing. So it's not necessarily the best representative of self-defense or combat, type of action. In Jiu-Jitsu, for example, Aikido, Hapkido, you're going to do a Tai Toch, something simple. Okay, you have a circular movement to go in, and you're fairly relaxed, hopefully, because if you're not relaxed, you can't blend, you can't have I, okay? And you can't be pliant, you can't have Ju. And so you get into position, but there's an instance where your body goes into Kime to have that final throw. So there's the blending portion, but then there's an instance of maybe a second, a couple of seconds, where you do have to tighten to do that, where your hip locks into place, or ogoshi, or, any type of throw like that. So if you think of it that way from a strike, because again, when we focus on the art, we think striking and we think, throws and things like that, but there's a place for both. So for striking, whether you're boxing or, really doing anything else, your hand is supposed to be, I'll turn sideways here, your hand is supposed to be relaxed. That's how you can move fast, okay? But at the moment, at the instant of impact, you tighten it and then you release. So majority of, if you're looking at from a timeline perspective, 95 or 97% of the movement, you're relaxed. But that 2-3% of the time is when you tighten and then you release, because there's impact and then there's penetration. So, so from the original question about, well, doesn't that take away from being able to do other things? For that instant, it does. But in that instant, you no longer have a need to do those other things because the stage is set. You already have Kazushi, they're off balance or their guard is down, and you're going in to capitalize, to finish your technique, whether it's a strike or a throw. And then you release, and then you become pliant again, Jew. So you're pliant most of the time, and then it's go, and then you release. And so to me, it's a matter of balance and knowing when to shift the balance rather than either this or that. And unfortunately, what happens as the philosophy changes, where people head more towards the sport or more towards combat or things like that, they start disregarding the certain techniques and certain strategies, and sometimes part of the science too, to fit their end. And that's okay for what they want to do. But when we start comparing, like we talked about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu versus, traditional Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came from Judo, okay? So, that's a sport oriented. By the time it reached Brazil, it had become a sport already. And so they took that for one-on-one matches and things like that. But even when I was, working with law enforcement, that wasn't the primary way to do things. You don't want to take somebody to the ground with all your gear and your gun and your pepper spray and anything else, not to mention what they may have on them. So any good martial art that survived for a long time, from a military perspective, always had weapons, always had striking, and always had grappling. Your primary method was always your weapon. Distance is your friend when there's multiple things going on the field or the street. If for whatever reason you lost your weapon or couldn't use it, then you kicked, you did whatever you could to keep them off of you. but you never really wanted to get close unless you had to. Now, if somebody was charging you, then great. You know, you can do a throw or something like that. If they're armored, you're not going to be able to kick and punch, you know, very effectively, right? So again, science, art, and philosophy, and all these things kind of have to work together, you know, in balance. Anyway, that's my 2 cents for whatever it's worth.
A lot more than 2 cents worth there. That was outstanding, Kris. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, very, very well said, Kris.
Okay. Yeah, Kris, it was a really good summary, and you kind of brought everything together there. And I really appreciate it, because, you know, I think we're all, I think this is a good way to end this topic, because you were able to kind of summarize everything, bring everything back to, for lack of a better phrase, back to center of what we were originally dealing with. Anyway, so I think we're going to stop with this topic. I've actually, in this discussion and a couple of comments before we got started, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably 4 to 6 additional topics here for discussion, including Darren's, comparing traditional versus Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and we'll probably throw a couple other things in there by the time we get going, or by the time we get finished with that topic. And we've got a good list. And anyway, I as I said earlier, I do want to compliment everybody. Probably had more interplay and exchange of ideas this time than we've had ever before. And this is kind of like what I'm going after, because I am not the sole source of knowledge. And when I taught high school and even junior high, the kids knew it was easy to get me off track from the quote unquote lesson. But we would have the greatest discussions, and it's just, you have to, how do you say, you learn more by listening to people than you do from talking to people. So even though sometimes I talk too much, but some people are smiling now. But anyway, but I do, you know, that's the key to a good discussion, is being able to listen and have other people feel that they can say what they want to say without fear of any kind of repercussion or put down or what have you, and to exchange those ideas. So anyway, I think we're going to stop with this at this point. I'm surprised that discussion went on this one topic as well, as long as it did. I also want to thank Kris for kind of summarizing things and helping us recenter. And we will be meeting again on, this is the 6th, on March 20th, Saturday, March 20th. So put that on your calendar, and everybody go get your COVID shots if you haven't gotten them yet, as soon as you can. I had both of mine. I didn't have any reaction to with Pfizer. My wife had a 1-day bad reaction for her second shot. She's fine. And some people get reactions to both shots. And if the Johnson, you only need 1 shot. So go for it, because I want all of you around. Anyway, hope you have a great week, and hopefully we'll get our dojos reopened soon and up and running. And I think that's about it. Unless anybody has anything else they want to say before we part ways.
I did have one question, Professor. When, like our dojo here has reopened in Southern Illinois, I'm able to start teaching again. So when that happens, I know Sensei Clark, for example, if I understand it, is a Saturday teacher guy. What do you think this is going to look like if we have dojos and school activities going on Saturdays?
That I don't know. The reason I scheduled mine for 8 o'clock in the morning, at least out here, is because there's someone else at 10 o'clock that has a weekly, another jiu-jitsu instructor who runs a weekly teaching seminar at 10 o'clock on Saturday mornings. I don't know what time I could find that would work well for everybody. And I know back east, if it's 8 o'clock here, it's 11 o'clock back east, and you're in the midst of things. So I don't know. Maybe it's a matter to ask all of you, send me an email and say, if your dojo is in operation, what is a good time for you? I don't know if I can accommodate you, but you know, the worst I can do is say no. You know, so just, yeah, but I'd like that information because I'd like this to be able to continue even after the real world gets back to some semblance of reality. Or the martial arts world gets back to some semblance of reality. So, or to be totally self-centered, I could say, well, you could make all your students show up at this particular time, and they can all be participants in this Zoom video, Zoom workshop. I mean, you know, I don't know. I mean, I don't object to that anyway, but I think if we can find a time, maybe the day has to switch to a Sunday. Maybe that's a possibility. Weekdays, I don't know, because some of you have to work for a living, and that's a reality. You know, so let me know, please. Give it some thought and send me an email. Let me know. And I'll do it because I'm retired. I have some flexibility, and I'd like to keep it going.
Great. Thank you. And thank you all, by the way, for chasing the rabbit of my question. I was hoping it would engender a lot of discussion. That was,
Okay.
For your question. It was a great question, obviously.
Good question.
It's a good question. I think we're out in the middle of the prairie someplace. We had a bunch of groundhog holes. So anyway, rather than rabbit holes. Kind of like the game where you hit the rubber animal pops up. You have a big hammer. And
Whack-a-mole.
What? Whatever.
Whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole. Right. So anyway, well, you have a great week. Any other closing comments or questions?
So long, y'all.
Okay, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Don't do anything too dangerous, and be safe and stay healthy.
Same.
Good to you.
Great to be back, Sensei.
Yes, good to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sensei.
Bye, Dave, TJ.
See you guys.